The sun-baked dirt of central Uruk holds its secrets tightly beneath thick compacted layers of sand and clay. In the year 1888, a team of archaeologists from the University of Pennsylvania arrived at a massive wind-swept mound of earth known to the locals as Nippur. This was the ancient city of Nippur, once the spiritual and administrative heart of the Sumerian Empire. They came equipped with heavy iron shovels, wooden picks, and the academic expectation of finding a civilization that had met a violent or desperate end. When a city dies, it usually leaves a chaotic, legible corpse in the soil. War leaves a distinct layer of black ash and shattered bone. Famine leaves mass graves and empty, broken granaries. Sudden drought leaves a trail of desperate migration, with valuables dropped haphazardly in the dust by people simply too weak to carry them. But as the trench workers dug deeper into the precinct of the Great Ziggurat, sinking their spades into dirt that had not seen sunlight in nearly 4,000 years, they encountered something entirely unexpected. They found drainage systems perfectly intact. These were not simply abandoned infrastructure, they were meticulously sealed. Heavy baked clay pipes, designed to carry seasonal water away from the sacred foundations, had been purposefully capped with thick, waterproof layers of bitumen, a naturally occurring pitch that requires deliberate heating and application. Votive objects, typically scattered, smashed, or looted during a societal collapse, were found carefully sorted, catalogued and stored in protected subterranean chambers. Tools were not dropped in a panic, they were put away. The massive wooden temple doors had not been battered down, they had been closed, locked, and the surrounding courtyard swept entirely clean. The accepted historical reading often points to shifting river courses or sudden nomadic invasions around the year 1950 before Christ to explain the end of the Sumerian Golden Age. But that traditional reading fails to explain the methodical, almost bureaucratic precision of what these 19th century archaeologists were uncovering in the trenches. We are looking at a civilization that did not suddenly fall, but simply packed up and initiated a planned, highly coordinated shutdown. Before we follow the evidence down into these deliberately buried corridors, I invite you to settle in. As we trace the silent, orderly departure of the ancient world's architects, I'm curious where you are listening from tonight. Wherever you are, let the quiet of the deep past anchor you. Let us return to the dirt of Nippur. To understand the sheer scale of this anomaly, you have to picture the physical reality of the excavation. The workers cut exploratory trenches over 100 feet deep into the mound. They moved thousands of tons of earth by hand, sweating under the harsh Mesopotamian sun, fully expecting to find the standard stratigraphy of human ruin. Instead, layer by layer, they uncovered a landscape of organized cessation. In the temple of Enlil, the chief deity of the Sumerian pantheon, the stone altars were systematically stripped of their daily offerings, but the structural integrity of the stone was carefully preserved. It is as if the inhabitants were preparing the massive building for a long, indefinite period of hibernation. This was not a localized phenomenon isolated to a single neighborhood in Nippur, as later archaeological expeditions would reveal across the wider Mesopotamian floodplains, from the ancient sun-bleached walls of Uruk to the maritime borders of Lagash. The exact same pattern repeated itself. Massive urban centers, housing tens of thousands of people, exhibited the same bizarre archaeological signature. Drainage networks deliberately capped, deep archival rooms sealed with heavy stone blocks, plazas cleared of everyday debris. The physical labor required to execute this kind of citywide preservation is staggering. It requires millions of man-hours, highly coordinated logistics, and a central authority capable of directing a massive workforce, not toward building something new, but toward putting an existing city to sleep. When a standard human population faces a catastrophic drought or a looming army of invaders, they do not pause to seal their plumbing with hot waterproof pitch. They do not carefully pack away heavy clay tablets in climate-buffered storage rooms. They run. They panic. The archaeological record of sudden collapse is universally messy. But the dirt tells a different story, one not of collapse but of a highly organized, deliberate closure. But the dirt tells a different story, one not of collapse, but of a highly organized, deliberate closure. When an ancient civilization falls, it leaves a very specific, chaotic signature in the earth. Archaeologists know exactly what to look for. They probe the soil for a burn layer, a thick black band of carbonized wood and ash that tells of invading armies, raging fires, and ultimate defeat. They look for scattered, broken weapons. They find unburied remains trapped under collapsed roofs, or hastily dug mass graves that speak of sudden famine or rampant disease. The end of an empire is loud, violent, and messy. Yet, in the great centres of the Sumerian Empire around the year 1950 BC, the soil reveals a chillingly calm procedure. There is no burn layer in the sacred precincts of Uruk or Lagash. There are no scattered weapons choking the courtyards of the Temple of Enlil. Instead, the earth presents us with the physical footprint of a massive bureaucratic shutdown. Consider the bitumen ceiling discovered in the lower levels of the Nippur excavations. Bitumen is a naturally occurring heavy petroleum, a thick tar-like substance that must be intensely heated to become pliable. It is not something you casually apply while fleeing from a marauding army. The priests and administrators of these cities took the time, likely weeks of coordinated labour, to heat enormous vats of raw bitumen. They methodically poured this industrial sealant over the vital infrastructural nodes of their temples, capping the complex drainage systems to protect them from the elements over deep time. The votive objects, the sacred items meant to appease their rulers, were not looted or smashed. They were carefully catalogued, wrapped, and safely stored in subterranean chambers. Even the heavy bronze tools of the labourers were neatly organised and left in designated staging areas. It is as if the entire workforce simply clocked out of their shifts, locked the doors, and walked away, fully expecting someone to eventually return and resume operations. This is a staggering anomaly. Cities do not simply turn off the lights and pack up their infrastructure without a catastrophic reason. To coordinate the simultaneous peaceful evacuation of tens of thousands of people across multiple independent city-states requires an immense, top-down authority. It requires a master plan. We are standing at the edge of a deep time mystery, looking down into the perfectly swept foundations of a world that chose to empty itself. As we sit with this quiet, organised silence, I wonder where you're listening from tonight. Whether you are resting in a softly lit room in a modern, bustling city, or looking out at a dark rural sky, we're all connected by this shared human curiosity about the people who walked the earth long before us. Feel free to share where your corner of the night is as we journey together through these ancient shadows. Now, let's return to the dry dust of Mesopotamia. The standard historical model attempts to explain this organised abandonment through natural, gradual means. Scholars often point to shifting river courses or prolonged droughts, but that explanation fails to account for the meticulous, labour-intensive packing of the temple complexes. A drought forces a slow, agonising migration. It does not result in the sudden, synchronised capping of underground infrastructure with heavy-duty sealants. There is a stronger alternative reading of the evidence, but it requires us to step away from the comforting assumptions of modern archaeology. It requires us to listen to what the Sumerians themselves explicitly wrote down on their clay tablets. They did not say the rivers dried up. They did not say the crops failed. They said their rulers, the Anunnaki, made a council decision to leave the earth. For over a century, modern academia has treated the Anunnaki merely as mythological constructs. They are categorized as storm gods and fertility deities, invented by early farmers to explain the harsh, unpredictable realities of the ancient world. When the ancient texts describe these beings taking to the sky and abandoning their earthly domains, historians read it as a poetic religious metaphor for political collapse. But a metaphor does not pour heated industrial bitumen over a city's drainage system. A religious allegory does not meticulously catalogue physical artefacts and seal them in underground vaults for future retrieval. If we look at the physical evidence, the clean dirt, the locked doors, the organised tools, we are forced to ask a deeply uncomfortable question. What if the Sumerians were not writing poetry? What if they were recording a literal historical log of a physical logistical departure? We are going to re-examine the accepted history of this massive ancient withdrawal. We are going to strip away the mythological lens and look at the actual mechanics of a civilization that was intentionally packed up and put into deep storage. To understand this departure, we must look not at their myths, but at their administrative paperwork. To understand this departure, we must look not at their myths, but at their administrative paperwork. Consider the physical reality of a cuneiform tablet. It is a piece of river clay shaped by hand, baked in the sun, or fired in a kiln. Into this clay, a scribe presses a reed stylus, leaving wedge-shaped marks. It is a slow, deliberate technology. It does not invite sweeping emotional narratives. It is designed for cold, hard data. Traditionally, when we imagine the written legacy of the ancient world, we picture grand epics of creation and poetic hymns to the heavens. But the soil of Mesopotamia tells a different story. The overwhelming majority of the millions of tablets recovered from the sands of modern-day Iraq are shockingly mundane. They are receipts. They are inventory logs. They are daily yield reports for grain, wool, and beer. Yet, buried deep within these mountains of daily bureaucracy, there are specific clay ledgers that document something entirely different. When early scholars first translated these particular texts, they applied a standard theological lens. They read them as mythological poetry. They interpreted the writings as metaphors for divine wrath, or symbolic stories of gods abandoning their temples because the human population had become too noisy or sinful. But if you read these exact same tablets as a supply chain manager would, the language changes completely. We must reconsider the entities the Sumerians called the Anunnaki. We have been taught to view them as a pantheon of tempestuous ethereal gods, ruling from the clouds through magic and thunder. The administrative ledgers, however, paint a deeply grounded physical picture. In the daily records of the temple complexes, the Anunnaki do not behave like ethereal spirits. They behave like a highly organized, physically present ruling class. They required specialized housing. They consumed specific measured rations of food that had to be cultivated and delivered by human workers. They issued precise directives on agricultural yields, metallurgical production, and urban planning. The ancient ziggurat was not merely a place of whispered prayers. It was a regional headquarters. It was a distribution center, a tax collection agency, and a logistical hub. The Anunnaki were, in every practical sense, a bureaucratic administration managing a vast planetary estate. And then, as the centuries turned toward the year 1950 before the Common Era, the ledgers document a massive systemic shift. The texts record a grand assembly. This was not a mystical gathering of spirits, but a formal council meeting of the highest administrative tier. A decision was made to liquidate the operation. The clay records detail the systematic dismantling of their localized authority. It is a process recorded without panic, written with the same dry precision as a grain inventory. We see allocations of raw resources being abruptly halted. We see orders for the formal cessation of temple maintenance. The text describes specific high-ranking individuals being reassigned, and massive stores of precious metals being rapidly consolidated and moved. It reads exactly like a modern multinational corporation preparing to permanently close a continent-wide network of factories. There is a category of Sumerian texts known as the Lamentations. For generations, historians have treated these as sad, poetic songs, mourning the loss of cities to drought or invasion. They feature phrases describing how the sheepfolds have been given to the wind and how the masters have stepped away from their houses. But through an administrative lens, these are not poems of mourning. They are post-action decommissioning reports. They describe the departure of the administrators in stark logistical terms. The texts dictate exactly what infrastructure must be sealed, what must be dismantled, and what must be left behind. They describe the local human populations, who had been engineered for generations to serve this vast supply chain, suddenly left without management. The meticulous instructions found in these clay ledgers dictate the capping of the plumbing, the sealing of the doors, and the final archiving of the essential data. The sheer volume of logistical planning required to execute this withdrawal is staggering. Every tool was accounted for. Every drainage system was capped. Every temple door was secured with thick bitumen. You do not stop to take inventory and seal the plumbing when a flood is washing away your city. You do not carefully pack the archives when an invading army is at the gates. You perform these actions only when you're executing a carefully calculated, highly organized exit strategy. The administrators were leaving, and they were ensuring the facility was properly mothballed before they locked the doors. This bureaucratic silence did not happen in just one city. It echoed across the entire region. This bureaucratic silence did not happen in just one city. It echoed across the entire region. The excavations at Nippur were merely the first thread pulled from a much larger tapestry of sudden absence. Moving south across the Mesopotamian floodplains, archaeologists uncovered the ancient city of Uruk. Here, the evidence buried in the dirt openly defied standard historical models of urban decay. When a civilization falls to famine or conquest, the archaeological record is chaotic. Buildings collapse, valuables are scattered, and defensive perimeters are breached. We expect to find the carbonized signature of a burn layer. But beneath the sands of Uruk, researchers found a massive metropolis that had been methodically put to sleep. Deep within the temple precincts of Uruk, excavation trenches revealed structural renovation projects halted mid-stride. Heavy blocks of quarried limestone were found meticulously stacked beside half-finished altars. The copper tools of the stonemasons were not dropped in a panic. They were laid out in perfectly straight rows, carefully cleaned and counted. Clay vats used for mixing binding agents were scraped completely clean and covered with heavy lids. It was as if an entire workforce had been instructed to take a temporary pause. Instead of returning, workers applied thick layers of bitumen sealing over the exposed unfinished walls. This was a labour-intensive process designed specifically to protect the vulnerable mud brick structures from the elements over an indefinite period of time. This exact pattern repeats itself further east, within the ruins of the great city-state of Lagash. Here, the physical markers of organised abandonment reach an almost eerie level of precision. The monumental temple drainage systems of the city, networks of fired clay pipes engineered to carry away the heavy runoff of daily rituals, were not choked with the debris of a dying city. Instead, they were completely flushed out. The interior clay walls were painstakingly scrubbed, allowed to dry, and deliberately plugged with custom-fitted clay seals. People fleeing for their lives from an invading army do not pause to waterproof half-finished projects. A starving population does not inventory their chisels or cap their plumbing. This is the unmistakable physical signature of a planned, systemic decommissioning. Radiocarbon dating and stratigraphy place this synchronized closure within a remarkably tight temporal window. Across the region, this coordinated cessation of activity converges precisely around the year 1950 BC. From the ziggurats of Nippur to the administrative hubs of Uruk and the ritual centers of Lagash, the engines of the Sumerian Empire were turned off simultaneously. The sheer geographic scale of this regional cessation forces a complete re-evaluation of the ancient world. Consider the physical evidence left resting in the dust. The aligned rows of copper tools, the scrubbed drainage pipes, the heavy bitumen applied to unfinished walls. Every measurable metric points to a society executing a pre-calculated exit protocol on a massive scale. To coordinate the peaceful shutdown of a single temple complex requires staggering administrative control, but to halt the economic and architectural engines of multiple fiercely independent city-states at the exact same time is an anomaly that defies conventional explanation. It suggests that local rivalries were suddenly superseded by an overriding mandate. The physical dirt of Mesopotamia tells a story not of a tragic collapse, but of a highly organized departure. The great temples were not abandoned to the desert winds. They were sealed, preserved, and left waiting. Such a synchronized shutdown requires a central command, a final directive issued from the highest authority. Such a synchronized shutdown requires a central command, a final directive issued from the highest authority. The regional cessation we observe in the mud brick of ancient Mesopotamian cities, the carefully sealed drainage systems and the meticulously cleared ziggurats, did not happen spontaneously. It was organized. It was ordered. To find the source of that order, we must return to the physical clay tablets recovered from the ancient archives, specifically those documenting what is known as the Grand Assembly. In the quiet, temperature-controlled vaults of modern museums, there are fractured cylinders of baked clay that contain the primary source material for this event. Nested within the texts that document the final days of the Sumerian Empire is a description of a gathering that preceded the Great Silence. It is the record of a formal council. For over 150 years, translators have approached these specific passages as religious poetry. They envisioned a pantheon of mythical beings, draped in celestial light, sitting in the clouds and passing arbitrary magical judgments on humanity. But when you strip away the 19th century romanticism and read the cuneiform exactly as it was etched into the clay, the atmosphere changes entirely. The terminology used in these specific assembly tablets is not mystical. It is starkly administrative. The words describe a convened session of the Anunnaki, functioning not as untouchable deities, but as a highly organized governing board. The texts outline a structured environment. There is a presiding authority. There is a presentation of current terrestrial conditions. There is a formal debate among the regional managers. The so-called divine decree that emerges from this assembly is recorded with the dry, methodical precision of executive meeting minutes. The texts detail a literal, voted-upon decision to withdraw their physical presence from the earth. The Anunnaki, who had operated as the direct administrators of agricultural quotas, urban development and resource extraction, were formally voting to terminate their operational mandate. This was a calculated policy shift. It was not a chaotic flight from an invading army, nor was it a panicked retreat from a sudden environmental collapse. It was a scheduled systemic decommissioning of their terrestrial enterprise. What is perhaps most striking about these assembly records is the emotional weight preserved within the rigid bureaucratic language. The texts do not describe triumphant conquerors eagerly returning to the stars. They describe administrators experiencing profound distress. The cuneiform meticulously records the deep formal sorrow of the Anunnaki leadership as they ratified the withdrawal. They were severing ties with an infrastructure they had spent millennia constructing. They were deliberately stranding the human proxy populations they had so carefully organized, trained, and managed. The weeping recorded in the clay is not a mythological metaphor for thunderstorms or seasonal floods. It reads as the genuine, heavy reluctance of a ruling class forced by an overriding higher directive to abandon their life's work. The decision was final, binding, and absolute. The assembly concluded, and the executive order was distributed across the regional centres, from the high temples to the lowest agricultural outposts. The era of direct management was over. With the decision made, the focus shifted entirely to the immense logistics of packing up a civilization. Deep within the climate-controlled archives of modern museums, resting on custom foam supports, sit fragmented clay tablets covered in tightly packed wedge-shaped marks. These are the cuneiform ledgers, the administrative heart of the ancient world. When we examine a specific stratum of these records, those dating to the period immediately following the Grand Assembly, the nature of the accounting abruptly changes. The divine decree had been issued. With the decision made, the focus shifted entirely to the immense logistics of packing up a civilization. What scholars hold in their hands are not mythological poems detailing the emotional sorrow of departing deities. They are departure manifests. They are dry, methodical, and relentlessly precise. When an administration spanning multiple city-states prepares to leave, the process is not a sudden vanishing act in a flash of light. It is an exercise in extreme bureaucratic discipline. The Anunnaki required an accounting of every asset and every piece of specialized equipment before the withdrawal could proceed. Reading these texts is like reading a modern shipping ledger. The rhythmic listing of inventory reveals the staggering scale of the operation, yet it is delivered in a wonderfully mundane tone. There are tallies of cedar timber, carefully graded by length and weight. There are volumetric measurements of refined precious metals, categorized not as wealth, but as industrial resources. There are manifests recording the transfer of heavy bronze astronomical instruments, dismantled from the upper terraces of the ziggurats and crated for transport. The lists go on, line by line. Tens of thousands of sheep, hundreds of vats of purified oils, dozens of highly specialized mechanical components, their exact functions lost to translation, catalogued simply as essential conveyance hardware. The texts speak of the preparation of great vessels, entirely avoiding the language of modern science fiction. There are no descriptions of spacecraft. Instead, the scribes use the vocabulary available to them, describing massive transports, specialized conveyances, and the immense provisioning required for an unimaginably long journey. The ledgers document the allocation of specific fuel sources, bitumen, refined oils, and rare crystalline materials, measured out to the fraction of a shekel. It is a portrait of a cosmic event reduced to the tedious. Necessary accounting of weight distribution and cargo capacities. Perhaps the most fascinating aspect of these departure manifests is the strict categorization of what was to be taken versus what was to be left behind. The scribes were instructed to divide the world into two distinct columns. In one column went the critical hardware, biological samples, and refined metallic alloys. In the other went heavy stone tools, agricultural surplus, and the foundational architecture of the cities. The texts reveal a calculated, unsentimental triage. Anything that could not be easily transported or that was deemed too heavy for the conveyances was systematically logged for abandonment. This contrast between the grand scale of the departure and the exhausting, mundane accounting required to execute it is profoundly jarring. We are conditioned to think of ancient rulers ascending to the heavens in an instant. Magical event. Yet the physical clay tells a story of inventory managers working long into the night by the flicker of oil lamps. Every ounce of weight had to be justified. Every disassembled tool had to be accounted for in the master ledger. The sheer volume of these administrative records proves that the withdrawal was a physical, logistical reality. They were packing up their operational nodes, preparing their conveyances, and balancing their load requirements with absolute mathematical precision. But leaving a planet is not as simple as packing away tools. There was the glaring problem of the infrastructure that could not be moved. But leaving a planet is not as simple as packing away tools. There was the glaring problem of the infrastructure that could not be moved. Consider the physical reality of the Mesopotamian basin. It was not a natural, self-sustaining paradise. It was a massive, highly engineered machine. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers had been tamed by thousands of miles of artificial canals, deep trench levees, and complex hydraulic locks. This was a violently terraformed landscape. If the executive managers, the Anunnaki, simply boarded their vessels and vanished into the sky, this terrestrial machine would immediately fracture. The rivers would breach their banks. The intricately balanced agricultural grid, which reliably fed massive populations, would choke with silt and collapse into an uninhabitable swamp within a single generation. Then there was the human question. Standard historical narratives often reduce ancient populations to primitive farmers or subjugated labourers, blindly building monuments under the threat of a whip. But the administrative ledgers pulled from the temple archives reveal a vastly different dynamic. The human population was a highly specialised, deeply integrated workforce. They were the technicians, the canal dredgers, the grain accountants, and the masons. Yet, for all their specialised skill, they were entirely dependent on a top-down executive structure. They did not design the hydraulic system, they simply maintained their assigned sectors. They relied entirely on the ziggurats, the central logistical hubs we explored earlier, for the distribution of seed, the calculation of planting seasons, and the mathematical authorization of structural repairs. Imagine the sudden, permanent removal of every global supply chain manager, every power grid operator, and every chief engineer in the modern world, all on the exact same afternoon. That was the precipice facing this ancient society. The departure manifests recorded in the clay did not just tally grain reserves and transport capacities. They highlighted a looming, systemic catastrophe. You cannot simply turn off a fully operational civilization. An abrupt exit meant the immediate ecological and structural death of the entire region. The very infrastructure that allowed human life to flourish in an arid basin would quickly invert into flood zones and famine traps. The Grand Assembly understood this mechanical reality perfectly. The physical cessation of the temples was not a panicked flight, but a methodical risk assessment. The infrastructure abandonment had to be carefully managed. If the departing administration ever intended to return to a functioning outpost, rather than a buried wasteland, the terrestrial machine had to be kept running on standby. The specialized human workforce could not be left to scatter into the desert. They needed a new operational protocol. But this presented the ultimate logistical dilemma. How do you maintain an advanced architectural and agricultural network, one requiring precise astronomical and mathematical calculations, using a workforce that has never been allowed to make an independent executive decision? The knowledge required to balance the hydraulic pressures of the Euphrates, or to align the temple observatories with the changing equinox, was highly restricted. It was heavily compartmentalized within the highest tiers of the administration. To hand the human workforce all of this knowledge at once would be a profound loss of control. To give them nothing would guarantee absolute collapse. The equation demanded a compromise between total abandonment and continuous rule. The solution was a phased handover, relying on a select few who would remain behind. The solution was a phased handover, relying on a select few who would remain behind. We see the physical record of this protocol etched into cylinder seals from the 21st century BC. In these intricate limestone carvings, a seated figure does not hand down a magical blessing to a kneeling human subject. Instead, the seated figure extends a solid measuring rod and a coiled measuring line. These are not symbols of divine magic. They are the concrete tools of an architect. They are the precise instruments of a surveyor. It is a formal, documented transfer of operational authority. The primary administrators of the Anunnaki were severing their direct physical connection to the terrestrial infrastructure. But a logistical system of this staggering magnitude could not simply be left to run blind. It required a skeleton crew. Historical texts from this transitional period begin to change their tone in a measurable way. The Grand. Sweeping decrees of the Grand Assembly vanish entirely from the cuneiform ledgers. They are replaced by highly localized fragmented directives. This was the beginning of the era of the remaining custodians. For centuries, classical historians have read the later Sumerian texts and categorized certain figures as demigods or minor deities. They were labeled as lesser spirits of agriculture or mythological wardens of the underworld. But when viewed through the strict lens of organized systemic decommissioning, an entirely different profile emerges. These were not magical beings born of divine lineage. They were mid-level transition managers. They were proxy administrators left stranded on a world that had just lost its primary administrative power source. Consider the specific figure recorded in the ledgers as Ningish Zida. In classical mythology, he is often described cryptically as a guardian of the throne, or a secondary deity associated with the deep roots of the earth. But read his actions as recorded in the architectural records of the time, and the mythological poetry strips away to reveal cold logistics. Ningish Zida functions almost exclusively as a site manager. He's tasked with overseeing the final sealing of subterranean vaults and the precise redirection of regional water tables. He does not summon storms or hurl lightning from the heavens. He calculates load-bearing stresses for deep underground structural supports. He is an engineer, left behind to manage the long-term preservation of a decommissioned grid. The physical presence of these proxy managers fundamentally alters our understanding of the post-withdrawal world. The remaining custodians were operating under a severely reduced mandate. Without the logistical hub of the fully active Ziggurat network, their capacity to project authority was sharply limited. They could no longer terraform entire river valleys or coordinate massive workforce transitions across thousands of miles. The vast Mesopotamian hydraulic terraforming projects were largely complete, but they now required quiet generational maintenance. The skeleton crew had to adapt to a harsh new reality of scarcity. They possessed the comprehensive blueprints of the old world, but they lacked the massive industrial machinery required to rebuild it. This severe logistical bottleneck forced a radical change in management style. Direct, highly visible rule from the summit of the ziggurats was no longer mathematically viable. The human workforce, previously organized into massive centralized labor camps, was beginning to naturally fragment into autonomous city-states. If the proxy managers attempted to maintain the old authoritarian structure without the backing of the heavily loaded departure manifests, the entire fragile equilibrium would collapse under the weight of human rebellion. The historical data points to a highly calculated shift in strategy. The remaining custodians initiated a program of extreme compartmentalization. They began to systematically isolate specific operational knowledge. They broke down the previously unified sciences of astronomy, hydrology, and architecture into separated, highly guarded disciplines. By intentionally fragmenting the master blueprint, they ensured that no single human uprising or regional ecological collapse could wipe out the entire operating system. But this defensive strategy also meant that the true, unified purpose of the infrastructure was deliberately obscured from the general population. The visible, towering administration dissolved, replaced by a decentralized network of carefully selected human liaisons who only understood their small fraction of the machine. The era of the towering, unapproachable administrator had ended. These remaining managers could not rule openly. Instead, they retreated to the shadows, establishing protocols that would echo through history. These remaining managers could not rule openly. Instead, they retreated to the shadows, establishing protocols that would echo through history. Consider a physical clay tablet from the library of Ashurbanipal, specifically a manual for ancient ritual specialists. Traditionally, this text is read as a book of magic. It details precise incantations, exact measurements of specific minerals, and strict timings based on stellar alignments required to awaken a divine statue inside the temple sanctuary. The accepted academic reading dismisses these instructions as elaborate superstition, a psychological comfort mechanism for an ancient people. But when you examine the sheer rigidity of the text, that explanation begins to fracture. The instructions are overwhelmingly structural, reading more like a mechanical calibration sheet. Why would an ethereal spirit require a precise acoustic frequency, down to the exact duration of a chanted syllable, to inhabit a stone? Why does the ritual mandate the washing of hands with specific alkaline solutions before touching the inner sanctuary? Why does a magical spell require the exact same steps, in the exact same order, without a single deviation, or risk catastrophic failure? The stronger, more unsettling reading is that we're not looking at magic at all. We are looking at a degraded maintenance protocol, as the original architects of the Mesopotamian infrastructure withdrew. The proxy administrators, those mid-level transition managers left behind, faced a profound logistical crisis. They had to ensure that the human workforce could maintain highly complex systems without actually understanding the science behind them. The solution was strict compartmentalization. They created what history would later call the ancient mystery schools. Today, we tend to romanticize these esoteric traditions as gatherings of enlightened philosophers pondering the universe. In reality, the evidence suggests they were intense, strictly regimented training academies for human technicians. Initiates were taught through relentless rote memorization. A novice did not need to understand the underlying physics of acoustic resonance or crystalline energy storage. They only needed to know that if they did not chant the precise words at the precise pitch, while holding the precise metallic instrument, the communication relay would fail. The punishment for altering a single step of the ritual was severe. This was not the irrational religious zealotry of a later age. It was a strict hazard containment policy. You do not let an untrained apprentice improvise while handling volatile equipment. Over centuries, a tragic but inevitable linguistic drift occurred. The original instructors, the remaining custodians who understood the true mechanics, eventually vanished. The human proxies were left entirely alone with the manuals. Generation after generation faithfully copied the cuneiform texts. But the foundational context was gone. Technical vocabulary mutated into religious dogma. The word for a localized power source translated over time into a glowing divine presence. The instructions for broadcasting a specific acoustic frequency became a sacred hymn. The strict sanitation protocols required for entering a sterile environment slowly devolved into the abstract concept of spiritual purity. You can see the physical residue of this transition in the artifacts that survived. The coiled measuring line and the measuring rod, the very tools of the architect which we observed on the 21st century BC cylinder seals, became the magical wands and sacred staffs of the priesthood. Protective gear required to handle specific materials became the heavy robes of the high priests. The acolytes were pantomiming a science they no longer comprehended, faithfully executing the movements of a machine that had long since been powered down. They maintained the watch, perfectly repeating the gestures of the departed. But human memory is fragile, and oral traditions fade. The most critical knowledge required a more permanent vault. But human memory is fragile, and oral traditions fade. The most critical knowledge required a more permanent vault. We have seen how the remaining custodians attempted to manage the transition of power through proxy administrators and early mystery schools. Yet, flesh and blood are inherently vulnerable. Over generations, the linguistic drift of technical vocabulary was an absolute certainty. What began as a precise atmospheric or hydraulic maintenance protocol would inevitably degrade into a chanted ritual, the original engineering intent lost beneath layers of mysticism. The architects of the systemic decommissioning understood the mathematics of decay. They knew that across a span of thousands of years, the surface of the earth would be scoured by localized floods, torn by shifting river courses, and burned by the inevitable march of warring, expanding empires. To leave the master blueprints of their infrastructure entirely in the hands of a surface-dwelling skeleton crew was an unacceptable logistical risk. A secondary, parallel system of preservation had to be established. This brings us to a specific architectural anomaly, referenced quietly in the shattered fragments of later Assyrian and Sumerian records, the concept of the houses of sealed wisdom. For decades, traditional translators viewed these references as poetic metaphors for the minds of wise men. or perhaps a symbolic description of the heavenly afterlife. But when we apply the lens of administrative literalism, a different, far heavier picture emerges. The houses of sealed wisdom were not allegorical spaces. They were physical, geographic locations. They were subterranean vaults, engineered to withstand the violent, unpredictable permutations of deep time. Imagine the sheer, crushing weight of the earth. The construction of these facilities required an entirely different paradigm from the towering ziggurats that scraped the Mesopotamian sky. If the ziggurat was a logistical hub reaching upward to facilitate observation and departure, the houses of sealed wisdom were anchors sinking downward to ensure civilizational continuity. The texts describe structures carved into stable bedrock, intentionally situated away from the volatile floodplains of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. These were not hastily dug cellars beneath temple floors. They were multi-chambered complexes lined with massive, interlocking stone blocks. To prevent the intrusion of groundwater, the engineers utilized the same heavy bitumen ceiling that we saw applied so meticulously to the drainage systems of Lagash, but executed on a massive industrial scale. The genius of these underground archives lay in their total passivity. Active maintenance requires continuous energy, and energy requires an organized workforce, a luxury the departing Anunnaki no longer possessed. Therefore, the vaults had to maintain a stable internal climate without any active mechanical intervention. By sinking the chambers deep enough into the crust of the earth, they harnessed natural geothermal stability. The temperature remained absolute. The humidity was locked into a permanent equilibrium. Inside these lightless halls, the air grew perfectly still. It was an environment designed for one singular purpose, the indefinite suspension of physical decay. And what was placed inside these lightless vaults? The fragmented departure manifests suggest it was not wealth, at least not in the traditional human sense. There were no piles of gold or ornamental jewels left to gather dust. The cargo was raw data. These vaults housed the master copies of the cuneiform ledgers, inscribed not on fragile unbaked clay, but carved directly into imperishable diorite and quartz. They contained the original measuring rods, the coiled measuring lines, and the foundational blueprints for the hydraulic terraforming networks that had originally made the desert bloom. They stored the physical templates of the civilization's operating system, sealed in total darkness, waiting for a specific, mathematically calculated moment of retrieval. To build such structures requires more than just brute force. It requires a profound predictive understanding of geology, load-bearing architecture, and the deep-time behavior of shifting water tables. These were not simple stone basements. They were feats of deep earth engineering. These were not simple stone basements. They were feats of deep earth engineering. Consider the physical reality of a subterranean vault constructed hundreds of feet below the surface. The primary enemy of underground preservation is not time, but water. To combat the relentless intrusion of groundwater, the architects utilized a highly refined version of the bitumen ceiling we encountered in the surface temples. But here, deep within the bedrock, the application was entirely different. They did not merely paint the walls with tar. They engineered complex alternating layers of fired brick, kiln-baked clay, and boiling bitumen, creating an impermeable hydrostatic barrier. This was a composite material designed to flex with tectonic shifts, while maintaining a perfect moisture seal. It is a level of hydrological engineering that requires a profound understanding of fluid dynamics. For a civilization supposedly working with basic tools and early mathematics, creating a waterproof void at that depth is an extraordinary anomaly. Then there is the sheer weight of the earth above. Millions of tons of solid rock and compacted soil pressed down continuously on a hollow chamber. Standard Bronze Age post and lintel construction would snap under a fraction of that pressure. Instead, these deep earth facilities utilized advanced load-bearing techniques. They employed precise corbelled vaulting and inverted arches, distributing the crushing weight of the subterranean world outward and downward into the surrounding bedrock. The geometry is flawless. The chambers were designed so that the heavier the earth above them became, the tighter and more stable the structural interlocking grew. They weaponized the mass of the earth to protect the empty space within it. But the most striking feature of the houses of sealed wisdom is their autonomous climate control. A sealed room underground will eventually succumb to stagnant humidity, condensation, and slow decay. Yet these vaults were designed to breathe. Microshafts, often no wider than a human hand, were drilled through hundreds of feet of solid limestone directly to the surface. These were not random ventilation holes, they were calculated thermal chimneys. By harnessing the natural temperature differential between the cool subterranean floor and the sun-baked surface, these shafts created a continuous, passive convection loop. Cool air was drawn in, circulated around the inner chambers, and expelled, maintaining a perfectly stable internal temperature and humidity level. This system required no moving parts, no human intervention, and no fuel. It was an engine powered entirely by the geometry of the Earth and the physics of air. It was designed to run autonomously for millennia. Traditionally, when archaeologists uncover deep shafts or heavy stone vaulting, the structures are categorized as elaborate tombs or royal cellars. But that standard reading fails to explain the exactness of the thermal regulation. A tomb does not require continuous measured airflow to prevent delicate materials from oxidizing. A grain silo does not need alternating hydrostatic shock absorbers. The physical evidence points to a different intent. These spaces were engineered as survival capsules for fragile, highly sensitive artifacts. We must also confront the physical difficulty of their creation. Excavating thousands of cubic yards of dense bedrock requires industrial force. Mainstream history suggests this was achieved with thousands of labourers wielding stone hammers and soft copper chisels over generations. Imagine the logistics of carving out these spaces. Workers would have been operating in absolute darkness, hundreds of feet below the water table, breathing thick stone dust. To achieve perfect structural resonance under those conditions with simple hand tools borders on the impossible. The tool marks often tell a different story. The sheer verticality of the ventilation shafts and the millimetre-precise levelling of the floor blocks suggest a method of excavation that was fast, calculated, and entirely uncompromising. They cut through the earth with the confidence of a civilization that knew exactly what it was building and exactly how long it needed to last. They built an environment that suspended time. They locked away the atmosphere itself, creating a perfect, unchanging void beneath the chaos of the shifting world above. What exactly was so valuable that it required such extreme measures of preservation? The intricate network of passive convection loops and hydrostatic barriers beneath the Mesopotamian floodplains raises an unavoidable question. What exactly was so valuable that it required such extreme measures of preservation? When 19th century archaeologists first breached the outer seals of similar subterranean structures, their expectations were deeply conditioned by the tombs of Egypt and the royal graves of Ur. They were looking for wealth. They expected to find burial chambers overflowing with lapis lazuli, silver vessels, and the jeweled remnants of dead kings. But the deeper they dug into the specific administrative complexes tied to the systemic decommissioning of the region, the more those expectations fractured. The houses of sealed wisdom were not designed to hoard wealth. They were designed to hoard operational continuity. To a highly advanced administrative bureaucracy preparing for a millennial absence, gold was merely a soft, highly conductive metal with limited structural utility. The true currency of the Anunnaki was data. The treasure they buried was purely informational. Consider the fragments of bronze and polished quartz recovered from the deepest undisturbed excavation layers. Traditionally, academia catalogues these isolated finds as ritual amulets or ceremonial weights, but when examined through the lens of utilitarian preservation, a much sharper reality comes into focus. We find dense, heavily inscribed diorite ledgers etched with a mathematical precision that defies the rudimentary copper tools of the era. We find the oxidized remains of intricate bronze mechanisms that functioned as localized astronomical calculators engineered to track specific orbital periods over thousands of years. Within the mythological texts, there are frequent references to objects known as the Tablets of Destiny, or Stones of Power, which were said to dictate the fate of cities. Stripped of their mythological gloss, these objects function entirely within the narrative as high-capacity data storage. They were crystalline or lithic blueprints. These archives were not poetic musings on the afterlife or prayers to invisible deities. They were the raw utilitarian schematics of an entire civilization. The deep ledgers contained the exact hydraulic specifications of the regional terraforming networks. They held the precise orbital mechanics required to predict cyclical astronomical alignments. They stored the agricultural baselines of the domestic crops engineered to feed the remaining proxy workforce. This was the ultimate backup drive of an empire, etched into the hardest, most degradation-resistant materials available on Earth, and sealed away in the dark. But a preservation system is useless if it is vulnerable to the chaotic rise and fall of surface populations. The texts detailing the closure of these facilities emphasize a strict protocol of compartmentalization. These vaults were not meant to be accessed by the general public, nor were they intended for the mid-level human managers left to run the daily affairs of the surface cities. The records indicate that these subterranean data cores were meant to be opened only by specific, authorized personnel. They were secured with complex physical locks and architectural dead ends that required exact operational knowledge to bypass. The texts suggest that only those holding the precise proxy keys passed down through the deepest echelons of the ancient mystery schools would know how to navigate the thermal chimneys and access the archives. To a wandering looter or an invading army, the structures would appear as nothing more than solid, impenetrable foundations, or empty, echoing basements of long-forgotten temples. The sheer volume of technical data preserved in these dark, quiet rooms indicates that the ruling class was not abandoning their project to ruin. They were putting the Earth into a state of suspended animation. They were leaving behind the instruction manuals required to reboot the global system upon their scheduled return. And as modern ground-penetrating radar begins to peer beneath the sands of other ancient sites, we are realizing that this protocol of compartmentalized preservation was not an isolated incident. This architectural strategy of burying data was not confined to the sands of Mesopotamia. This architectural strategy of burying data was not confined to the sands of Mesopotamia. If we trace a line roughly 1,200 miles to the west, we arrive at the solid limestone expanse of the Giza Plateau in Egypt. Traditionally, the accepted reading of this site is entirely surface-oriented, viewing it as a grand terrestrial necropolis built upward to serve as tombs for pharaohs. But that traditional framework focuses exclusively on the visible stones baking in the desert sun. It fundamentally fails to explain what modern, non-invasive technology is currently revealing in the absolute dark beneath the bedrock. In recent decades, culminating in major scanning projects in the year 2017, researchers deployed ground-penetrating radar, acoustic mapping, and cosmic ray muon radiography across the Giza complex. These tools measure the density of solid matter by tracking subatomic particles as they rain down from the cosmos and pass through the Earth, requiring no invasive drilling. What these particle shadows and acoustic returns have revealed is a massive, deliberate architecture of subterranean voids. These are not natural fissures carved by ancient underground rivers. The data shows precise right angles, descending corridors, and massive vaulted chambers situated deep beneath the surface, completely sealed off from the monuments above. This physical, measurable fact forces a profound re-evaluation. The stone of Egypt aligns perfectly with the clay administrative texts of Mesopotamia. The Sumerian records we examined earlier spoke explicitly of the houses of sealed wisdom. Deep, climate-controlled archives designed to preserve critical blueprints and technological ledgers. Acoustic scans of the voids beneath Giza reveal the exact physical realization of those cuneiform descriptions. We see evidence of identical hydrostatic barriers, utilizing the natural water table to seal off deeper levels. We see the same deployment of thermal chimneys and passive convection loops, engineered to maintain a constant, unvarying temperature regardless of the climatic chaos occurring on the surface. Mainstream archaeology often categorizes these inaccessible voids as merely unfinished tombs or symbolic underworlds, but that interpretation fails under the weight of the engineering complexity. Symbolic underworlds do not require perfectly calculated passive ventilation systems. The deep architecture beneath Giza exhibits a level of redundant, functional design that mirrors the Mesopotamian fail-safes. It is an environment built specifically for the long-term stable preservation of physical materials, not for the ritual burial of the dead. The implications of this correlation are immense. We are observing the physical footprint of the Anunnaki departure manifests. If an advanced administrative body is systematically withdrawing its presence, and it knows the surface of the planet will endure thousands of years of geological and human turbulence, it does not leave its most vital operational data in a single, vulnerable location. It builds redundancy. It establishes multiple, identically engineered vaults in highly stable geological zones across the globe. The Giza Plateau, sitting on a massive, secure shelf of limestone, is the perfect geographic parallel to the deep vaults of the Sumerian plains. We must, however, recognize the explicit limit of our current understanding. We have not yet breached the deepest of these newly scanned voids at Giza. The physical hydrostatic barriers remain intact, and modern excavation policies rightly prevent blind drilling into these ancient sealed environments. We cannot walk down into those vaulted chambers to read what might be etched on their walls, or catalogue what blueprints might be resting on their floors. We only possess the ghostly outlines provided by subatomic particles and sound waves. But those outlines are exact. They describe a subterranean reality that shifts this narrative away from isolated local myths and toward a highly organized systemic operation. The ancient texts dictated the construction of secure planetary archives, and modern physics proves that such structures physically exist, waiting silently in the deep earth. These parallel structures point to a unified global fail-safe protocol. Beneath the sun-baked clay of the Mesopotamian floodplains and the limestone bedrock of the Giza Plateau, the architectural signatures remain identical. They are massive, they are entirely passive, and they are completely silent. When modern geophysicists examine the sheer scale of the subterranean voids detected by cosmic ray muon radiography, a singular realization begins to take shape. These complexes were not designed for human habitation. They lack the basic infrastructure of daily life, the ventilation required for large breathing populations, or the defensive bottlenecks of a traditional fortress. Instead, the houses of sealed wisdom function as something far more profound. They are planetary hard drives. They are a read-only backup of a departing civilization. To understand the engineering required for such a task, one must abandon the human scale of time. Human history operates in brief, frantic centuries. We build our greatest structures to outlast our grandchildren, perhaps our great-grandchildren. The architects of this global fail-safe protocol built structures to outlast the memory of civilization itself. The inclusion of hydrostatic barriers and passive convection loops was not a defense against a sudden, localized catastrophe. It was a calculated mathematical defense against the slow, grinding decay of deep time. Consider the terrifying foresight required to design an administrative facility for a 10,000-year operational lifespan. The original planners understood the extreme volatility of the surface world. They calculated the precise rate at which tectonic shifts would stress the subterranean bedrock. They factored in the inevitable rise and fall of global sea levels, the shifting of the monsoon belts, and the cyclical return of prolonged drought. They also anticipated the human variable. Above ground, human empires would eventually shatter under the weight of resource scarcity and war. Cities would be reduced to ash, and the scattered survivors would rebuild, completely unaware of the legacy buried beneath their feet. The vaults were engineered to sit quietly in the dark while humanity suffered through its own violent amnesia. This is the essence of a true fail-safe. It does not attempt to prevent the disaster. It merely ensures that the core data survives the aftermath. Inside these isolated chambers, protected by hundreds of feet of solid rock, the crystalline or lithic blueprints of the ancient world were locked away in a state of suspended animation. There is no panic in this architecture. There is no frantic doomsday preparation here. The perfectly cut diorite ledges and the carefully balanced thermal chimneys reflect a cold, bureaucratic certainty. The Anunnaki, or whoever the ultimate administrators truly were, executed a methodical archiving process. They boxed up the operational manuals of human civilization, sealed them beneath the bedrock, and walked away. The crushing weight of this realization changes how we view the ancient world. We are not looking at the ruins of a primitive people striving to appease angry gods. We are looking at the abandoned filing cabinets of a highly advanced administration that knew exactly how long it would be gone. They understood that biological memory is extraordinarily fragile. Spoken words shift, languages die, oral traditions distort into mythological poetry over a few dozen generations. But granite, quartz, and deep earth passive climate control endure. The global fail-safe protocol was designed to bypass human forgetfulness completely. It was built to wait out the turbulent infancy of our current historical era. The archives sit in absolute darkness, maintaining a perfect baseline temperature, indifferent to the millennia ticking by on the surface. They are an eternal, silent testament to a scheduled, distant return. Yet, even the most impenetrable archive presents a fundamental logistical problem. A read-only backup requires a precise mechanism for retrieval. The massive stone doors and the proxy keys supposedly hidden within the ancient mystery schools were not designed to be accessed by just anyone who happened to dig a hole in the sand. The system required a specific, verified user. The architecture could protect the data from the ravages of time. But a locked vault is useless without someone authorized to open it. We have examined the hydrostatic barriers and the passive convection loops designed to protect the subterranean archives of the departing Anunnaki. We have traced the architecture of preservation across the ancient world. Yet, physical infrastructure, no matter how brilliantly engineered, cannot maintain itself indefinitely without a designated custodian. The departure manifests required a secondary system, not of stone, quartz, or diorite, but of flesh and blood. To understand this system, we must look at a highly specific physical object currently resting in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. It is a small, four-sided clay prism, measuring just under 8 inches in height. It was discovered in the early 20th century, pieced together from fragments found scattered across the Mesopotamian sands. Covered in dense, tightly packed cuneiform script, it is known today as the Sumerian King List. At first glance, the prism appears to be exactly what its name suggests, a chronological ledger of the rulers of Sumer, detailing who held power and for exactly how long. The later entries on the clay surface correspond perfectly with known historical figures, documenting ordinary men who built city walls, fought regional wars, and signed trade treaties. But the earlier sections of the prism, specifically the entries recording the rulers who governed before the Great Flood, present a profound and unsettling anomaly. The text attributes lifespans to these early rulers that completely defy natural human biology. One king is recorded as ruling for 28,800 years. Another is documented as holding the throne for 36,000 years. Traditionally, this is viewed by academia as mythological exaggeration. It is often explained as a poetic device, a political fiction used by later, mortal kings to legitimize their rule by associating themselves with ancient godlike ancestors. But that explanation sits uncomfortably alongside the physical reality of Sumerian culture. This was a civilization of obsessive, uncompromising accountants. They recorded the exact volumes of seasonal barley yields, the specific daily allocations of beer rations, and the precise geometric measurements of field boundaries. They practiced a strict administrative literalism. The idea that these meticulous, data-driven record keepers would suddenly abandon their adherence to factual reality when documenting their own chain of executive authority feels utterly out of character. What if the prism is not a work of mythological poetry, but perhaps better understood as a precise, biological tracking ledger? If we strip away the assumption of ancient exaggeration, we are left with a terrifyingly clinical document. The Sumerian King List explicitly states that kingship was, according to the translation, lowered from heaven. Traditionally, we read this as the philosophical origin of the divine right of kings. But in the context of an organized, systemic decommissioning of the Anunnaki administration, that phrase takes on a highly technical weight. It suggests a calculated transfer of operational authority. The Anunnaki were leaving the surface, and they required proxy administrators to remain behind to manage the transition. But you cannot simply hand over the keys to a global failsafe protocol to an untrained, unmodified human population. The biological requirements for interfacing with the ancient proxy keys, or surviving the unique atmospheric pressures of the subterranean thermal chimneys, may have demanded highly specific genetic traits. The King List, therefore, may not be a list of individual men living for tens of thousands of years. Instead, it could be a ledger of highly specific, genetically engineered bloodlines. The massive spans of time might not represent the lifespan of a single king, but rather the duration that a specific genetic sequence, a biological authorization code, remained viable and active within the human population. It was a continuity program masquerading as a royal lineage. It was a method to ensure that, even thousands of years after the departure manifests were finalized and the temples were sealed, there would still be human custodians carrying the exact biological markers required to access the houses of sealed wisdom. When viewed through the lens of biology rather than mythology, the impossible numbers begin to make a chilling kind of sense. The four-sided clay prism resting in the Ashmolean Museum does not read like a poem. Its surface is divided into rigid, methodical columns, pressing deep into the baked earth to record an unbroken chain of names and numerical values. When viewed through the lens of biology rather than mythology, the impossible numbers carved into this Sumerian King List begin to make a chilling kind of sense. Trace the sharp indentations marking the reign of the very first ruler, Alulim. The cuneiform wedges tally his time in power at an astonishing 28,800 years. For over a century, the standard academic reading has dismissed these massive figures as standard, base 60 numerological exaggeration, assuming ancient scribes artificially inflated these reigns merely to manufacture political prestige. The mathematical decay rate etched into the subsequent columns contradicts that assumption. A purely mythological text inflates numbers randomly for dramatic or poetic effect, but the numbers on this clay prism degrade along a precise, exponential curve. This is not the arithmetic of folklore or the chaotic exaggeration of storytellers. It is the methodical, measurable signature of biological half-life. The early staggering lifespans recorded at the top of the clay represent a literal biological baseline. The original Anunnaki administrators, before their planned departure, possessed a physiology entirely foreign to the rapid decaying cycles of the Earth. Their extended lifespans were not metaphors for divine magic, but stark physical reality. The King List acts as an observational ledger, recording the baseline lifespan of a fundamentally different organism, one engineered to endure deep time. A distinct horizontal dividing line of text cuts across the center of the prism, marking the catastrophic environmental event known as the Great Deluge. Immediately beneath this physical dividing line, the numerical values fracture. The tallies plummet abruptly from tens of thousands of years to 1200, then to 900, and eventually down to mere decades. This steady, irreversible numerical collapse on the clay surface documents the literal dilution of that original genetic baseline. As the generations progressed without the physical presence of the departed architects, their isolated biology inevitably mixed with the terrestrial population, causing the extended lifespan to naturally and permanently degrade. Hundreds of secondary clay cylinder seals recovered from the Third Dynasty of Ur depict meticulous royal family trees, binding specific heirs to strictly vetted consorts. These genealogical maps have long been interpreted as standard diplomatic treaties securing regional borders. Yet, they read very differently when placed alongside the plummeting biological metrics of the King List. They outline the parameters of a tightly controlled multi-generational breeding program. The remaining proxy managers were attempting to arrest the biological degradation, deliberately orchestrating marriages to concentrate whatever fragmented physiological traits of the original rulers still remained within the human population. The trace elements and specific genetic markers embedded in royal blood acted as the literal biological authorization code required to operate the dormant houses of sealed wisdom. The ruling class was not merely preserving a political dynasty for the sake of earthly power. They were desperately trying to maintain a living biological key. Biological continuity was the only mechanism capable of ensuring the automated doors to the underground archives would recognize their operators when the appointed time arrived. Humanity itself was being managed as a living, breathing ledger, a biological vessel designed to carry the physical memory of the Anunnaki until their scheduled return. The administrative obsession with keeping this biological baseline intact eventually spilled over from the mating ledgers into the physical architecture of death. We can see the physical evidence of this biological obsession in the tombs they left behind. We can see the physical evidence of this biological obsession in the tombs they left behind. Beneath the baked earth of southern Iraq within the royal cemetery at Ur lies a quiet, undisturbed space excavated in the 1920s. Archaeologists descending into the deep burial shaft found an environment carefully engineered for absolute permanence. At the centre of this subterranean chamber rested the physical remains of a figure identified as Queen Puabi. She lay on a wooden bier surrounded by an overwhelming concentration of gold, lapis lazuli, and carnelian, sealed entirely away from the elements. As we uncover these ancient vaults and sit with the quiet weight of history, I wonder where you find yourself listening from tonight. The atmosphere within the tomb was not one of simple mourning, but of meticulous, almost clinical preservation. Puabi's remains exhibited physical characteristics that immediately drew the attention of early researchers. Her skull structure and cranial volume presented subtle anomalies, differing slightly from the standard anatomical profiles of the surrounding population. Traditionally, these variations are attributed to cranial binding or the isolated genetics of early royal families. Yet, The extreme measures taken to preserve her physical forms suggest a different priority. The chamber itself was constructed to isolate the biological material from moisture and decay, utilizing layers of compacted clay and specialized masonry. This was not merely a resting place for a revered leader. It was a biologically sterile vault, designed to protect a highly specific genetic asset. The objects buried alongside her are routinely catalogued by museums as symbols of immense wealth and prestige. Elaborate headdresses of beaten gold, intricate cylinder seals, and heavy beaded necklaces covered her remains. But when viewed through the lens of a continuous multi-generational biological tracking program, these items transform in their function. They were not simply jewelry meant to display earthly riches in a mythical afterlife. The cylinder seals, carved with microscopic precision from hard stones, acted as physical authentication keys. They bore the unique insignias of a specific lineage, a permanent barcode of ancestry that verified her exact position within the biological continuity established by the departed administrators. Consider the specific placement of lapis lazuli and gold upon her remains. In the context of ancient Mesopotamian infrastructure, these materials were frequently utilized for their resonant properties within the subterranean houses of sealed wisdom. Placing them in direct contact with a prime biological specimen implies a physical verification protocol. The elaborate gold headdress, sprawling like a complex network of metallic leaves, mirrors the descriptions of the proxy keys worn by those who interacted with the remaining custodians. It was a uniform of clearance, a physical indicator that the biological hardware beneath it possessed the genetic authorization to interface with the legacy systems. Surrounding Queen Puabi in the wider death pit were the remains of numerous attendants, guards, and musicians. Mainstream history views this as a display of autocratic power, a mass human sacrifice to serve a queen in the netherworld. Yet, the archaeological record shows a quietly orderly event. There are no signs of struggle and no trauma on the bones of the retinue. They lay in precise, organized rows, each holding a small clay cup near their hands. This suggests a voluntary, highly synchronized shutdown protocol. If Puabi was a critical node in a carefully cultivated biological network, her attendants were the necessary support structure, decommissioning themselves in unison when the primary asset reached the end of its operational half-life. They were components of an administrative system, entering a permanent sleep state alongside their primary keyholder. Every element of the tomb in Uruk, from the structural waterproofing of the chamber to the specific anomalies of the cranial structure to the precise arrangement of resonant metals, points to a society obsessed with preserving a specific genetic frequency. The rulers of the third dynasty of Uruk, and those who came before them, were not hoarding wealth for the sake of human vanity. They were maintaining a fragile, highly engineered link to the deep past. They understood that their authority, their very right to exist as the governing layer of humanity, was written directly into the marrow of their bones. This obsession with blood purity was not born of vanity, but of administrative necessity. This obsession with blood purity was not born of vanity, but of administrative necessity. Consider the earliest royal artifacts recovered from the deep strata of ancient cities like Ur and Uruk. The rulers and high priests depicted on these stone reliefs are consistently shown holding very specific physical implements: a coiled measuring line, a straight measuring rod, a heavy stone scepter. For generations, traditional historical analysis has classified these objects as mere artistic metaphors for temporal power. They are widely interpreted as early political propaganda, a way for ambitious, ancient warlords to convince the masses that their authority was mandated by the heavens. But that conventional reading struggles to explain the rigid, mechanical uniformity of this idea across entirely disconnected cultures. From the floodplains of the Tigris and Euphrates to the distant highlands of Mesoamerica, the core requirement for leadership was remarkably identical. Brute force or strategic brilliance was never enough. True authority required a specific, heavily documented biological lineage. This is the true genesis of what later historians would call the divine right of kings. Modern scholars treat the divine right of kings as an abstract philosophy. It is viewed as a convenient legal fiction constructed by the ruling class to maintain absolute order. But when we place this concept back into the context of a systematic, organized abandonment by an advanced administration, the abstraction vanishes. The divine right of kings was not originally a metaphor. It was an operational protocol. It was the surviving, degraded memory of a literal biological authorization code. When the Anunnaki Council finalized their departure, the vast infrastructure they left behind was not meant for public access. The subterranean archives, the passive environmental controls, and the remnant communication arrays required highly specific clearance to operate. The biological tracking ledger, immortalized in the clay prisms of the Sumerian King List, was the mechanism designed to preserve that clearance. The royal bloodline was the physical keycard. To be anointed a king in the deep ancient world meant you possessed the exact genetic signature required to interface with the remaining terrestrial systems. As the centuries compounded into millennia, the physical reality of this arrangement dissolved into pure ritual. The deep earth vaults sealed themselves away beneath layers of accumulating silt. The original proxy managers faded into the shadows of the ancient mystery schools, their technical vocabulary drifting into the language of magic and myth. The original, functional purpose of the genetic program was forgotten by the very people who were executing it. Yet, the breeding protocols continued. This is the quiet tragedy of the ancient royal courts. The human proxies faithfully maintained their biological markers long after the corresponding technology had vanished beneath the earth. The machines went silent, but the ritual outlived them. An early king gripping a diorite scepter was no longer holding a functional tool or a proxy key. He was pantomiming an inherited memory, repeating the physical motions of an administration he no longer understood. This hollowed-out protocol echoed forward through thousands of years of human history. The divine right of kings eventually devolved into a simple, unquestioned justification for terrestrial power. Monarchs and emperors across the globe claimed a mandate from heaven, entirely unaware that the mandate was originally a highly technical biological prerequisite for a defunct network. The glittering crowns and sprawling dynasties of recorded history are, in a sense, simply the cargo cult of a forgotten bureaucracy. The rulers of the ancient world were selectively bred to remember, even as the true substance of that memory slipped through their fingers. They were the designated custodians of a silent kingdom, guarding doors they no longer knew how to find. While the kings held the keys, the rest of the population was assigned a different role entirely. If you examine the archaeological footprints of early Mesopotamian cities from the 3rd millennium BC, you do not see the chaotic organic sprawl of simple villages slowly expanding into towns. You see something that looks remarkably like a modern industrial supply chain. Entire urban centres were zoned for highly specific systemic tasks. The city of Uruk might focus heavily on monumental architecture and administrative oversight, while a neighbouring settlement functioned almost exclusively as an agricultural processing hub, surrounded by precisely calculated irrigation grids. Another city would be dedicated entirely to textile production, or metallurgical refinement, or the continuous churning out of bureaucratic receipts. The populations living within these walls were not merely surviving the ancient world, they were operating a massive distributed machine. We have traditionally viewed the dawn of civilization as a story of spontaneous human invention, a sudden and miraculous leap from nomadic survival to complex urban life. But when viewed through the lens of the Great Withdrawal, a much different architecture emerges. Civilization itself was a maintenance program. It was a custodial system running on autopilot. The complex rituals, the rigid social hierarchies, the obsessive charting of agricultural yields, these were not just the cultural quirks of a developing society. They were standard operating procedures. The human workforce was tasked with keeping the planetary facility operational, while the primary administrators were away. This does not mean the human population functioned as unthinking components of a machine. The reality is far more compelling. The system required immense, adaptable ingenuity. Humanity innovated brilliantly, but they did so almost entirely within the strict parameters of the maintenance protocols. They engineered better ploughs, not to free themselves from labour, but to ensure the temple granaries remained full to the exact specifications demanded by ancient clay ledgers. They refined geometry and mathematics not for abstract philosophy, but to calculate land boundaries, water displacement, and tax yields with flawless precision. They were the ultimate proxy managers, left in charge of a vast estate, using all their creativity and intellect to keep the ancient infrastructure humming through the centuries. To ensure this global system did not simply dissolve into chaos over deep time, a profound psychological mechanism had to be embedded into the cultural bedrock. This was the origin of divine expectation. The departing administrators, the Anunnaki, were never mourned as dead ancestors. They were revered as absentee landlords who would inevitably return to audit the estate. Every temple ritual, every seasonal festival, every careful cataloguing of grain was essentially a status report. The populace was conditioned to believe that their very survival depended on maintaining the infrastructure exactly as it had been handed down to them. The fear of divine wrath was, in practical terms, the fear of failing a catastrophic performance review upon the return of the architects. This instilled a pervasive generational vigilance. Generations were born, lived, and died with their eyes fixed on the horizon, maintaining massive canals they did not initially design, and filling storehouses for masters they had never physically seen. The act of waiting became the defining characteristic of the human psyche. The religious texts of the era are filled with deeply anxious pleas, asking if the daily work is satisfactory, and asking when the long absence will finally end. The entire architecture of early society was designed specifically to resist change, to freeze the operational state of the world in perfect obedient amber. They were holding the line. In this light, human history is not just a series of random events, it is a long, sustained holding pattern. In this light, human history is not just a series of random events, it is a long, sustained holding pattern. The physical archives buried beneath the arid plains of Mesopotamia were only one half of the preservation strategy. The other half was walking on the surface. When you examine the meticulously recorded lineages of the ancient world, from the Sumerian plains to the Nile Valley, you're not merely looking at political family trees, you're looking at a biological manifest. The clay prisms that recorded the lowering of kingship from heaven documented the installation of a biological authorization code. It was a genetic key designed to degrade as slowly as possible over millennia. Clay shatters. Diorite can be buried beneath hydrostatic barriers. But a living, reproducing population is a self-replicating ledger. Consider the highly stratified class systems that suddenly emerged at the dawn of recorded history. There was a rigid, almost overnight compartmentalization of human labor into specialized guilds. You had the metallurgists, the hydraulic engineers, the record keepers, and the astronomers. Traditionally, historians view this as the natural byproduct of agricultural surplus, a sudden luxury of free time. But viewed through the lens of a systemic decommissioning, it looks remarkably like a compartmentalized maintenance protocol. Each human caste was assigned a highly specific fragment of the operational manual. They were not building a new civilization from scratch in the dark. They were a skeleton crew, maintaining the complex machinery of a vanished empire. The rituals of the temple priests offer the clearest evidence of this biological archiving. For centuries they repeated exact phonetic incantations, carefully guarding the precise pronunciation of words they no longer understood. The meaning of the technical vocabulary was lost to linguistic drift, but the acoustic data was perfectly preserved in the biological memory of the priesthood. They were functioning as a read-only backup. The human mind was utilized as a storage medium for administrative literalism, passing down the fragmented memories of crystalline blueprints and proxy keys through oral tradition. It was the ultimate cargo cult of a forgotten bureaucracy. This fundamentally shifts how we must view the psychological condition of our ancestors. The profound, lingering anxiety present in ancient lamentations was not just the standard human fear of famine or drought. It was the distinct terror of a middle manager left in charge of a massive facility, without a clear timeline for the owner's return. The divine right of kings was a heavy, terrifying burden. The monarchs of the ancient world operated under an immense, crushing divine expectation. Every ruined temple they rebuilt, every silted canal they dredged, every elaborate sacrifice they offered was a desperate, organized attempt to keep the regional infrastructure running according to the original ancient blueprints. They were terrified of failing the inevitable audit. Generations lived and died within this massive architecture of waiting. The proxy administrators passed the coiled measuring line down through the centuries, an emblem of authority for a global project they could no longer fully comprehend. Over thousands of years, the human body itself became the final, most durable archive. Our deeply ingrained deference to unseen authority, our obsessive need to build monuments that outlast our own lifespans, our intrinsic unspoken feeling that we are supposed to be managing the earth. These are not merely evolutionary quirks. They are the lingering psychological echoes of our original programming. The realization is quiet, heavy, and profound. We have spent the last 4,000 years keeping the lights on in an empty house. The biological ledger successfully replicated itself, century after century, carrying forward a mandate written in the language of deep time. We became the living architecture of the very empire that abandoned us. But while the bloodlines preserved the authority on Earth, the eyes of the custodians were always locked on the sky. Humanity had become the living ledger, a self-replicating system of biological continuity designed to hold the line in the wake of the Great Withdrawal. But while the bloodlines preserved the authority on Earth, the eyes of the custodians were always locked on the sky. The physical records left behind in the dirt of Mesopotamia suggest that maintaining the human workforce was only half of the equation. The other half was tracking the exact trajectory of the architects who had departed. To understand this, we have to look at a specific pair of baked clay artifacts, dating back to the late 2nd millennium BC. They are known to archaeologists as the MUL.APIN tablets. Today, the most complete copies rest quietly in the archives of the British Museum, categorised under inventory numbers like 86,378. At first glance, they are unremarkable. They appear as two dense columns of cuneiform script pressed into the hardened clay, listing the names of constellations, the paths of the moon, and the rising times of various stars. For decades, the orthodox historical interpretation has treated the MUL.APIN strictly as an agricultural calendar. It is read as a practical almanac, a farmer's guide to the heavens designed to tell the ancient Sumerians and Babylonians exactly when to plant barley, when to expect the spring floods, and when to harvest. And on a superficial level, it does function in that capacity. But when you examine the actual data inscribed on the clay, that agrarian explanation begins to fracture. An agricultural calendar requires only a handful of easily visible seasonal markers. It does not require a highly precise three-dimensional geometric model of the cosmos. Yet the MUL.APIN contains exactly that. It divides the sky into three distinct domains, the paths of Enlil, Anu, and Enki, creating a spherical coordinate system. It records the exact heliacal risings of 71 specific stars and constellations. It measures the precise time gaps between these risings, mapping out the celestial sphere with a mathematical rigour that completely eclipses the needs of a Bronze Age farmer. The accepted reading fails to explain why an ancient agrarian society needed to track the zenith points of stars that had absolutely no bearing on the Mesopotamian weather cycle. It fails to account for the detailed cataloguing of planetary anomalies, retrograde motions, and stellar phenomena that occur deep in the cold mathematics of the night, long after the harvest is done. A stronger, alternative reading of the MUL.APIN strips away the assumption of primitive farming. When viewed through the lens of pure data, the clay tablet ceases to be a calendar. It reveals itself as a literal three-dimensional cartographic projection of the cosmos. It is a star map. The custodians left behind to manage the earthly transition were not looking up to decide when to plant wheat. They were looking up to monitor specific celestial corridors, the paths detailed in the MUL.APIN function perfectly as a navigational grid. If you're tracking a massive organised departure, a physical fleet moving outward into the solar system and beyond, you need a standardised reference frame to plot their trajectory. You need to know exactly where they went, and more importantly, the precise mathematical cycles governing when those celestial pathways will align again. The narrative shifts here, moving from the dust of the deep underground vaults to the silent, infinite expanse of the stars. The focus of the ancient world was entirely upward, obsessed with the slow, grinding mechanics of the orbital clock. But staring into the deep void of space and calculating the geometry of a multi-millennial return requires more than just a clay ledger. To track these immense cosmic movements, the custodians required equally immense instruments. To track these immense cosmic movements, the custodians required equally immense instruments. When examining the Great Ziggurat of Ur, it stands as an artificial mountain of baked earth, rising aggressively from the flat alluvial plains of ancient Mesopotamia. Constructed in the 21st century BC, its core is a solid, impenetrable block of unfired mud brick. This massive centre is wrapped tightly in a thick defensive skin of baked bricks, all meticulously mortared together with waterproof boiling bitumen. It is a heavy, imposing anchor locked into the dirt, The accepted historical reading of this structure is deeply familiar to anyone who has studied the ancient world. It is universally categorized as a religious edifice, a literal stairway to heaven. An elevated stage where a high priest could stand closer to the divine realm, physically separated from the noise, dust, and mundane existence of the city below. In this traditional view, the ziggurat is nothing more than a grand pedestal for worship, a towering monument to human devotion and religious theatre. But when you examine the physical architecture through the precise lens of structural engineering, that purely religious explanation begins to buckle under its own weight. The design tolerances of the Great Ziggurat far exceed the simple requirement of getting a priest closer to the clouds. The walls of the structure do not rise straight up. They lean inward at a precisely calculated angle. The horizontal lines of the vast terraces are not actually flat. They are subtly convex, bowing outward just enough to correct for the optical illusion of sagging over long distances. This is an extreme level of architectural precision that serves no ritualistic purpose. More critically, the sheer density of the structure presents a functional anomaly. The ziggurat contains millions upon millions of bricks, interwoven with layers of reed matting and thick, viscous tar. If the singular goal was merely elevation for a ceremony, there are far less resource-intensive methods to build a tower. A hollow structure with internal chambers, or a heavy timber-framed pyramid, would have easily sufficed to hold a temple and a priesthood, but a hollow structure vibrates. A timber frame sways and groans under the pressure of the wind. If you are attempting to map the exact spherical coordinates of the night sky, as recorded in the ancient MUL.APIN stellar ledgers, vibration is your enemy. If you're tracking the slow, agonizingly precise heliacal risings of distant stars to calculate a scheduled return across millennia, the slightest tremor in your foundation ruins the data. Step away from the concept of a religious temple and look at the ziggurat instead as a stabilized, vibration-damped instrument platform. To plot the paths of the heavens with mathematical certainty, the remaining proxy administrators needed a fixed, completely unyielding horizon. They needed an observation deck that would absolutely never shift, settle, or tremble. The massive, solid mud brick core of the ziggurat is not a primitive building technique. It is a highly effective seismic and acoustic damper. It absorbs the microscopic vibrations of the bustling industrial city of Ur. It deadens the kinetic shock of the wind sweeping across the open plains. The thick bitumen mortar prevents any subterranean water intrusion that could cause the massive foundation to heave or settle over decades of continuous use. The entire structure is physically paralyzed. Raised high above the severe heat distortion and blowing sand of the lower atmosphere, the flat upper terrace provided a flawless mount. This was not a stage for abstract prayer. It was a stabilized platform for sensitive, passive observation equipment. Sighting instruments, coiled measuring lines, and early analog calculating devices could be placed upon a surface that remained perfectly level and completely inert, night after night, century after century. The custodians were not ascending the steep steps to shout into the void. They were trained operators, climbing onto a massive terrestrial tripod. Every brick, every layer of tar, and every carefully calculated inward-leaning wall was engineered to serve the absolute integrity of the astronomical data collected at the summit. The structure itself is an earthbound machine, designed solely to hold a line of sight steady across deep time. The sheer mass of the brickwork wasn't for grandeur, it was for calibration. The sheer mass of the brickwork wasn't for grandeur, it was for calibration. To understand what was happening on the summits of these artificial mountains, we have to look closely at the artifacts pulled from the dirt beneath them. In the mid-19th century, during excavations at the ancient Assyrian city of Nimrud, archaeologists uncovered a small, seemingly unremarkable object. It was a piece of rock crystal, roughly 3 centimeters across, dating back nearly 3,000 years. Today, it is known as the Nimrud Lens. For decades, it was catalogued by museum curators as a mere decorative inlay, or a piece of polished jewellery. But modern optical analysis revealed something far more deliberate. The crystal had been ground with a toroidal surface. It possessed a specific, measurable focal length. It was, by all physical definitions, a functioning optical tool. When we place this piece of polished quartz back into its original context, the high-altitude, vibration-damped observation platforms of the Mesopotamian ziggurats, The architectural mystery begins to clarify. These structures were not empty altars waiting for invisible gods. They were reinforced housings for delicate instrumentation. Alongside the rock crystal lenses, fragments of finely calibrated bronze mechanisms have been identified in the broader region. While classical history often looks to later Mediterranean civilizations for the invention of analog computers and geared astrolabes, the foundational mathematics and the necessary metallurgy were already deeply embedded in the Mesopotamian basin. Sighting tubes crafted from copper and bronze, marked with precise degrees of arc, were mounted on fixed stone plinths atop the temple roofs. The architecture itself served as the macroscopic component of these precision instruments. Deep, narrow observation slots were engineered into the upper brickwork of the temples. These slots acted as massive architectural apertures, specifically designed to eliminate peripheral light pollution from the city below and isolate a tiny, targeted fraction of the night sky. By looking through these stone corridors, an observer equipped with a crystal lens and a bronze sighting gauge could measure the precise transit of a celestial body down to a fraction of a degree. The structural alignments were incredibly specific. The corners of the Great Ziggurats were not oriented to the simple cardinal points of the compass, but rather to the rising and setting azimuths of highly significant star clusters. They locked onto the heliacal risings of celestial markers like Sirius, the Pleiades, and the specific orbital corridors recorded in the spherical coordinate system of the MUL.APIN tablets. If the building shifted due to soil subsidence, the calibrations would fail and the data would be corrupted. That is why the foundations were built with such overwhelming, over-engineered mass. The building was the chassis of a massive terrestrial telescope, but a telescope requires an eye to look through it, and a mind to record what it sees. This is where the true scale of the ancient administrative project comes into focus. The celestial movements they were tracking, the slow drift of the galactic plane, the vast orbital cycles of distant bodies, the subtle precession of the equinoxes, do not complete their patterns within a single human lifetime. To measure them accurately requires continuous, uninterrupted data collection spanning centuries. This was the purpose of the highly organized priesthoods and the rigidly maintained biological lineages we examined earlier. The human operators were essentially organic components of the observation machine. Generation after generation, for thousands of years, specialized custodians climbed the stairs of the ziggurats. They slotted their bronze instruments into the stone grooves. They raised their quartz lenses to the sky. They recorded the exact position of the stars on heavy clay ledgers, passing the data down to their successors with uncompromising bureaucratic strictness. They were maintaining a celestial watch. The massive databases compiled in the underground archives were filled with these nightly measurements. It was an observational project of such staggering duration that it completely defies standard explanations of early agricultural timekeeping. Farmers do not need to measure stellar drift down to the minute of arc across a span of 500 years just to know when to plant barley. This level of mathematical obsession indicates a completely different objective. They were not just watching the stars drift, they were tracking specific predetermined routes. They were not just watching the stars drift, they were tracking specific predetermined routes. Stand on the damped, vibration-free summit of a Mesopotamian ziggurat in the deep night of the 2nd millennium BC. The observer is not a priest seeking omens, but a technician operating a massive static tracking station. Through the polished bronze sighting tubes and the toroidal rock crystal lenses, the night sky is not a canvas of myths. It is a highly structured, three-dimensional grid. The clay ledgers, meticulously updated generation after generation, focus intensely on a very specific architecture of the heavens. They divide the visible cosmos into 3 distinct bands. Mainstream history calls these bands the Way of Enlil, the Way of Anu, and the Way of Enki. For over a century, academic consensus has treated these divisions as purely poetic or religious constructs, a mythological geography mapping the domains of ancient deities. But this interpretation fails to explain the severe mathematical precision with which these bands are defined in the cuneiform astronomical texts. The Way of Enlil occupies the northern declination, the Way of Anu straddles the celestial equator, the Way of Enki dominates the southern sky. They are defined by specific degrees of arc, mapped against the rotation of the Earth with an accuracy that demands optical instrumentation. When we apply the lens of orbital mechanics to these ancient ledgers, the poetry dissolves into pure astrophysics. These are not mythological kingdoms, they are orbital corridors. In modern aerospace engineering, when a craft leaves the surface of a planet, it must follow a specific launch, azimuth, and orbital inclination to reach deep space efficiently. The Way of Anu, resting on the celestial equator, represents the optimal launch window for geostationary orbit, or a 0-degree inclination departure. The ancient texts do not describe gods walking across the sky. They describe heavy physical bodies ascending through these precise mathematical corridors, breaking terrestrial gravity and entering transit routes, the star roads. The concept of the star roads completely reframes the purpose of the multi-generational data collection. The scribes were not charting the stars to know when to plant wheat. Agricultural cycles do not require tracking the exact minute of a star's heliacal, rising over a span of 800 years. That level of fanatical continuous data collection serves only one functional purpose: telemetry. The astronomers were maintaining a mathematical lock on the precise outward trajectory of the Anunnaki withdrawal. They were measuring the slight, almost imperceptible perturbations in the orbital corridors. The records show an intense, almost obsessive focus on a highly specific sector of the night sky, deep along the Way of Anu. The ancient tracking stations were not looking everywhere equally. Their instruments were pointed toward a calculated vanishing point. The cuneiform prisms detail the intersection of specific constellations acting as navigational waypoints, marking the receding path of the departed architecture. It is a deep space trajectory recorded in clay, a flight path carved into the bedrock of human memory. The astronomers were tasked with keeping their eyes fixed on the exact coordinates where the massive logistical hubs had disappeared from view. Generation after generation, the human operators stood on their artificial mountains, adjusting their bronze sights, measuring the angles and updating the ledgers. They were executing a degraded maintenance protocol, holding the line long after the original architects had gone silent. They watched the star roads because that is where the departure manifest said the fleet had gone. This was not a search for meaning in the stars. It was a radar lock on a departing fleet. This was not a search for meaning in the stars. It was a radar lock on a departing fleet. When we examine the precise orbital corridors etched into the MUL.APIN tablets, we are not looking at the dawn of agrarian astrology or the poetic musings of early priests. We are looking at a documented trajectory. The cuneiform departure manifests from the 19th century BC detailed a massive, organized withdrawal, mapping out workforce transitions and the methodical abandonment of physical infrastructure. If the cessation of the regional administration was a masterclass in terrestrial logistics, the physical exit was equally calculated. The departing rulers did not simply vanish into the ether of mythology. They departed along a highly specific, mathematically rigorous azimuth. The ancient star roads were the designated highways of this withdrawal. The terrestrial tripods, the massive vibration-damped ziggurats acting as instrument platforms, were locked onto a calculated vanishing point. For the proxy administrators and the skeleton crew left behind in the silent temples, the directive was absolute. Watch the sky, track the coordinates, maintain the telemetry. Traditional historical models suggest that ancient humanity became obsessed with the stars out of a desperate need to predict the agricultural seasons. But planting wheat does not require tracking the heliacal rising of obscure deep space phenomena with a fraction of a degree of accuracy. It does not require a spherical coordinate system carved into solid quartz. This obsessive celestial record-keeping was not born of farming. It was an ingrained administrative duty. It was a biological imperative, passed down through the carefully managed royal bloodlines and the subterranean mystery schools. The early human custodians were not looking up to pray to abstract gods. They were fulfilling a final binding order to watch their architects leave. Imagine the profound weight of that long watch. Picture the first generation of custodians standing atop the Great Ziggurat of Uruk in the cool night air. Through their bronze sighting tubes, the initial departure might have been a brilliant, undeniable physical reality. A slow-moving anomaly cutting a deliberate path across the ecliptic plane. It was a tangible object, a piece of living architecture receding into the dark. But as the years turned into decades, and the decades stretched into centuries, that light grew fainter. The departing fleet slipped further into the deep, cold expanse of the outer solar system. The rhythm of the watch slowed. The bright spark became a dim, drifting star. Then it became entirely invisible to the naked eye. The remaining custodians had to rely on the toroidal surface of the Nimrud Lens to catch the last faint glimmers of the receding light. They recalibrated their instruments, adjusting for the vast distances, desperate to hold on to the visual proof of their mandate. Eventually, even the lenses were not enough. The physical light was gone. All that remained were the mathematical coordinates, dutifully copied from clay prism to clay prism, passed down to generations who had never seen the anomaly themselves. This is the quiet, overarching melancholy that permeates the ruins of the ancient world. Civilization as maintenance slowly degraded into civilization as memory. The kings and mid-level managers became a cargo cult of a forgotten bureaucracy, faithfully aligning their stone temples and calibrating their passive convection loops to honour a set of orbital mechanics they no longer fully comprehended. They stared into the blackness of the night sky, generation after generation, holding the line in the dark. They were the faithful watchmen of a silent void, tracking a ghost through the heavens. But in the mechanics of the cosmos, what goes out on a long elliptical orbit must eventually swing back. The universe, to the Mesopotamian mind, was not a straight line stretching blindly into an infinite void. It was a series of interlocking gears. It was a massive, silent clock. And to read this clock, they developed a mathematics based entirely on the number 60. We call it the sexagesimal system. You use it every day. 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. This is not a modern invention. This is a direct, unbroken inheritance from the administrators of the ancient world. It is the math of the circle. It is the math of the return. Every wheel turns. Every orbit completes its circuit. The clock ticks forward, but it always curves back to its origin. The cuneiform mathematical texts discovered deep in the Iraqi desert do not merely record the cycles of the moon or the local harvest. They record vast, staggering stretches of time. They utilize units of measurement that seem entirely unnecessary for a localized Bronze Age society. The foundational unit of their grand cosmic time was called the Sar. 1 Sar equaled exactly 3,600 years. They routinely calculated periods of 10 Sar, 20 Sar, and even 100 Sar. We must ask a fundamental question. Why did a civilization supposedly concerned only with seasonal floods and grain yields require a mathematical framework capable of tracking hundreds of thousands of years? The accepted reading within standard archaeology is that these massive numbers were purely mythological. They are traditionally dismissed as a poetic way of expressing the majesty of the ancient rulers through numerical exaggeration. But that explanation fails to account for the cold, mechanical precision of the calculations. The math on these clay tablets is not poetic. It is rigid. It is entirely orbital. A stronger alternative reading suggests these units were highly practical measurements. They were tracking astronomical bodies or administrative cycles that simply do not exist within our short-term, human-scaled view of the solar system. The custodians were tracking something on a very long leash. This is the core engine of cyclical time. In a cyclical universe, history is not an isolated event that happens once and fades away into the dust. History is a physical location on a track. If you know the velocity of an object, and you know the exact length of the track, you know exactly when it will pass your station again. The vibration-damped instrument platforms of the ziggurats, the bronze sighting tubes, the carefully maintained biological lineages. These overlapping systems were not built to mourn a permanent departure. They were meticulously engineered to calculate an arrival. The shift in the ancient records is subtle but profound. The desperate lamentations of the second millennium before Christ eventually give way to a different kind of literature. It becomes predictive. It becomes expectant. The departure manifests transformed over generations of observation into arrival schedules. This introduces the concept of the scheduled return. It is crucial to understand that this is not an apocalyptic doomsday prophecy. It is not a mythological end of the world. In the dry administrative mindset of the Anunnaki architecture, a return is simply the next phase of the contract. It is a systemic audit. It is the scheduled resumption of direct management. The gears continue to turn. 3,600 years form a single revolution. The ancient astronomers watched the ecliptic plane, noting the heliacal risings, measuring the microscopic slow drift of the stars. They understood that the silence of the sky was temporary. The dark void was merely the long invisible arc of an elliptical journey, reaching its furthest point. The mathematics demanded a return. The base 60 system was left behind to ensure that humanity would never forget how to count the days, the hours and the seconds until the orbit completed its circuit. We look at our modern watches today, counting in steady increments of 60, entirely unaware that we are keeping time on an ancient cosmic ledger. They bound our very concept of time to the geometry of their orbit. This posture of waiting, inscribed in clay and stone, did not end when the ancient empires fell. This posture of waiting, inscribed in clay and stone, did not end when the ancient empires fell. It simply went quiet, buried beneath the drifting sands of Mesopotamia, while the biological ledger of humanity continued to replicate and disperse. For millennia, the organized tracking of the sky degraded into fragmented folklore, but the underlying reflex, the deep, civilizational urge to construct massive, stabilized platforms and point them at the stars, never actually left us. It lay dormant, waiting for our engineering to catch up to our instincts. Think back to the Great Ziggurat of Uruk or the temple complexes of Nippur. We must remind ourselves what they functionally were. They were towering mountains of baked mud brick, carefully engineered to absorb the seismic hum of the Earth. They were terrestrial tripods, silent acoustic dampers designed to hold bronze sighting tubes steady against the turning vault of the night. It required the coordinated labour of tens of thousands, draining the economic output of a regional empire just to maintain a multi-generational gaze on a specific, calculated vanishing point. Now, project that same impulse forward into the 20th and 21st centuries. Picture the high deserts of the American Southwest, or the silent frozen plateaus of the Antarctic. Here, we find the exact same architectural intent, resurrected in the modern age. Massive parabolic dishes of steel and aluminum, resting on deep concrete pylons that isolate them from the tectonic tremors of the planet. These are our modern radio telescopes. Functionally and psychologically, they are the true descendants of the ziggurat. At first glance, a terraced pyramid of mud brick and a sprawling array of white titanium dishes seem completely different. But strip away the surface aesthetics and look only at the engineering, and the functional parallel is impossible to ignore. Both are monumental public works projects, built far from the vibrating centres of daily human life. Both demand the highest mathematical precision their respective eras can produce. Both require a dedicated priesthood of specialists to interpret the invisible data falling from the sky. And crucially, both are fundamentally passive instruments. They are not built to attack, and they are not built to travel. They are built to listen. They are built to wait. The continuity goes far beyond the architecture. When we analyse the telemetry of modern deep space tracking arrays, we find them sweeping the exact same orbital corridors that the ancient Sumerian astronomers recorded on the MUL.APIN tablets. Our modern search for extraterrestrial intelligence focuses intensely on the ecliptic plane, the narrow band of the solar system where planetary orbits align. 4,000 years ago, the watchers at Uruk called this exact same band the Path of Anu. They tracked the long elliptical orbits of celestial bodies through the very same windows of space that our supercomputers monitor today. We tell ourselves that we are simply conducting modern science, listening for random cosmic anomalies, but structurally humanity is executing the exact same deep time protocol established in the 21st century BC. We are a species that instinctively pools its resources to build colossal, silent ears, pointing them toward the outer solar system. We do not consciously remember the departure manifests, nor the scheduled return of an ancient administration. Yet, we are still standing on the high places, watching the star roads, scanning the void for a whisper from the dark. The technology has evolved from mud brick to titanium, but the fundamental protocol remains exactly the same. The technology has evolved from mud brick to titanium, but the fundamental protocol remains exactly the same. When we look at the massive parabolic dishes of modern radio observatories sweeping silently across the night sky, we see the pinnacle of contemporary astrophysics. We see humanity reaching outward, driven by what we believe is a spontaneous modern scientific curiosity. But if we carefully examine the architecture of our attention, a very different pattern emerges. We are not merely exploring the void, we are maintaining a watch. For over 4,000 years, the structural framework of human civilization has been organized around this singular quiet task. We call our sprawling global infrastructure a triumph of human invention, but it functions entirely as a deeply ingrained maintenance program. It is a civilizational holding pattern, established in the wake of a sudden and systemic departure. This reflex is etched so deeply into our collective memory that it has outlasted the conscious knowledge of who, exactly, we are waiting for. The physical ledgers of diorite have been replaced by digital archives, but the administrative expectation remains completely unchanged. Consider the modern search for extraterrestrial intelligence. It is an organized planetary effort to scan the cosmic microwave background for structured mathematical anomalies. We point highly sensitive deep space tracking arrays toward the distant star roads, filtering out the ambient noise of dead planets. We listen for a deliberate narrow-band radio frequency. We sweep the orbital corridors, meticulously cataloguing the vast silence. When we speak of the SETI initiatives, we frame them as a bold quest for first contact. Yet, the methodology is inherently retrospective. It is a sophisticated audit system designed to recognize an administrative rhythm, a signal that implies an intelligence we already subconsciously understand. The modern astrophysicist, sitting in a temperature-controlled observation room in the high desert, is executing the exact same biological and administrative function as the ancient Mesopotamian custodian standing atop the Great Ziggurat of Ur. The tools have shifted from coiled measuring lines to algorithmic signal processing, but the posture is identical. It is the posture of a sentinel. Why does humanity possess such an almost irrational obsession with the silence of the night sky? From a purely evolutionary standpoint, the empty void of deep space offers no immediate survival advantage to a terrestrial species. Yet, we dedicate massive fractions of our global resources and our most advanced technological infrastructure to staring into the dark. This is not mere scientific curiosity. It is a deep time reflex. It is the biological echo of a species that was genetically and culturally conditioned to act as a proxy workforce. We are the long-term descendants of the skeleton crew left behind in the ancient river valleys, still unconsciously carrying out the final orders of an administration that promised a mathematical return. We build our terrestrial tripods in deep, radio-quiet valleys and on high mountain peaks. We engineer massive acoustic dampers to isolate our sensors from the chaotic noise of the Earth, just as the ancient architects layered bitumen to stabilize their own observation platforms. We listen to the static of the universe, waiting for a cyclical pattern to repeat. The ancient texts warned that the wait would be long, spanning multiple biological half-lives of the human custodians. We have forgotten the precise names of the absentee landlords. We have lost the original technical vocabulary of the departure manifests, allowing it to drift into myth. But the deep time programming holds entirely firm. We are still the custodians, standing on our stabilized platforms waiting for a signal. We are still the custodians, standing on our stabilized platforms waiting for a signal. To grasp the true scale of what occurred in ancient Mesopotamia, we must view the physical evidence not as isolated mysteries, but as components of a single planetary machine. The first component is memory. The houses of sealed wisdom, buried beneath the ancient water tables, were not tombs, but read-only backups. From the diorite ledgers of the Sumerian Empire to the subterranean voids detected beneath the Giza Plateau, this was an architecture of endurance. It was built to survive geological upheaval, utilizing hydrostatic barriers and passive thermal chimneys to protect the blueprints of civilization. The departing administrators knew that surface structures would crumble and that human memory would degrade into myth, so they carved their operational manuals into stone and sealed them in the dark, waiting for a future generation capable of understanding them again. But a vault requires a key, and physical keys can be lost or stolen. The second component of this deep time architecture is the biological authorization code. The Sumerian King List, with its multi-generational breeding programs and staggering biological half-lives, was never a simple historical record. It was a self-replicating ledger. By intertwining their genetic markers with the local population, the departing rulers ensured that the custodianship of the planet would be self-sustaining. The divine right of kings was merely a degraded memory of this mandate. Humanity itself became the living architecture, a biological fail-safe carrying the encrypted authorization needed to access the underground archives when the scheduled return finally arrived. We were not abandoned to wander aimlessly. We were organized, specialized, and deployed as a planetary holding pattern. The third component is the gaze outward. The physical memory was buried below, the biological keys walked the surface, but the operational focus remained fixed on the sky. The Great Ziggurat of Ur and its sister structures were terrestrial tripods, vibration-damped platforms designed to track specific orbital corridors. The MUL.APIN tablets laid out the spherical coordinate system, the star roads mapping the exact launch azimuths and 0-degree inclination departures of the Anunnaki fleet. This was the Celestial Navigational Grid, a data collection project designed to calculate a scheduled return based on a long elliptical orbit. The ancient base 60 mathematics, the sexagesimal system, was built to handle cyclical time on a cosmic scale. When you step back and view these three pillars together, the fragmented puzzle of ancient history resolves into a cohesive system. It is a unified, deep-time architecture. The sudden regional cessation of duties in the 20th century BC was not a collapse. It was a systemic decommissioning. The drainage systems of Lagash were sealed with bitumen, tools were laid down in an orderly fashion, and the Grand Assembly issued its divine decree to depart. They left behind a skeleton crew of proxy managers, a degraded maintenance protocol that eventually morphed into the ancient mystery schools. The magic of the ancient world was simply the linguistic drift of technical vocabulary. We have spent thousands of years acting as a cargo cult of a forgotten bureaucracy, mimicking the rituals of our departed architects. Today, we still build massive parabolic dishes and point our deep space tracking arrays at the same narrowband radio frequencies sweeping the void for a whisper. Our search for extraterrestrial intelligence is not a new scientific endeavour. It is the oldest human reflex. We are still executing the final command of the departure manifests. We are watching the sky. It is a watch that has lasted for millennia, a silent vigil kept in the dark. It is a watch that has lasted for millennia, a silent vigil kept in the dark. We have built our entire world around a profound, quiet expectation. From the bitumen-sealed foundations of the Temple of Enlil to the vast parabolic dishes of our modern observatories, the posture of human civilization has remained remarkably consistent. We are a species that looks upward. We listen. We wait. As the noise of the daylight hours fades away, the true architecture of our history reveals itself in the silence. The urgency of the ancient scribes, the meticulous calculations of the orbital corridors, the heavy diorite ledgers buried deep beneath the earth, all of it settles into a quiet, enduring stillness. The grand administrative machine is at rest. The ancient architects have departed, leaving the custodians to tend to the quiet earth. Wherever you are right now, the same sky stretches out above your roof. If you were to step outside and look into the darkness, you would see the very same celestial grid mapped out on the clay prisms of Babylon. The light from those distant stars has travelled across the cold expanse of deep space, arriving here, tonight, just as it arrived upon the stepped terraces of the Great Ziggurat of Ur. The paths of Anu, Enlil, and Enki are still there, turning slowly in the dark. The spherical coordinate system remains unbroken. The stars do not hurry. They move with the heavy, measured grace of a planetary timepiece, a clock wound thousands of years ago, ticking away in the silence of the void. There is a profound comfort in this immense scale. When we place the brief, chaotic span of our daily lives against the backdrop of a multi-millennial holding pattern, the small anxieties of the day begin to lose their weight. The Sumerian Empire rose and fell. The great drainage systems of Uruk were sealed. The ancient kings completed their cycles, passing the biological authorization code down through generations, a slow, continuous chain of memory carried in the blood. You are a part of that continuous chain. You are the living ledger, resting in the quiet hours of the 21st century. The custodians do not need to build or calculate or worry in the dark. They only need to be. Let the vastness of that deep time settle over you. The ancient mystery schools taught that the night sky was not an empty void, but a quiet, moving architecture, a silent roof sheltering the earth. As the earth turns on its axis, leaning away from the sun, the shadows lengthen and the atmosphere cools. The heavy stone walls of the forgotten subterranean vaults maintain their steady, perfect temperatures. The hydrostatic barriers hold back the deep waters. The world is secure. The systems put in place nearly 4,000 years ago have done their job. The Earth remembers how to keep itself safe. The watch will continue tomorrow. The deep space tracking arrays will sweep the orbital corridors, and the mathematical cycles will advance by another fraction of a degree. But for now, the work is paused. The cuneiform ledgers are closed. The dust has settled over the ruins of Nippur, softening the edges of the ancient bricks, burying the anxieties of the past under layers of quiet earth. There is nothing left to decode tonight. There is no hidden mechanism you need to operate. The planetary machine is running smoothly on its own, drifting through the quiet expanse of our solar system, cradling its inhabitants in the dark. The rhythm of the night is slow. It is the rhythm of a base 60 cycle, the long sweeping arc of a distant orbit, moving so slowly it appears completely still. Let your own breathing match that ancient, unhurried pace. Draw in the quiet air and let it out into the dark. The silent vigil is kept. The custodians are resting. The long watch continues in the sky above, while the earth sleeps below.